progress.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to Lessons from the 4 Levels of Healing. I'm so excited to see all the people who are still logging in, and this is just wonderful. That just reaffirms for me that this is a topic that you all are really interested in, and I'm so glad, because we've been trying to figure out, how can we support everyone through this lingering pandemic, and certainly focusing on our healing in terms of our spiritual healing, our mental healing, our emotional and our physical healing is certainly one way to support all of us. And so the reason this event is happening is so that we can support you in finding the right balance, reconnecting with yourself during this time, and give you an opportunity to talk to several experts who are experts in their field, for either on the spiritual level. Our speaker tonight, his expertise is in spiritual life and development. Our speaker for the upcoming program is a psychiatrist, so his focus is on the mental aspect of life. We have a therapist who will support us with the emotional aspect of life. And then finally, on our closing night, we will talk with a dietitian and nutritionist around the physical aspects of life, our body and such. And so my name is Reverend Denise Junius, and I'm again really delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. We should really give all his credentials. He's Reverend Dr. Mike Leudde, but he's more than that. He's a friend. He's somebody that I love and somebody that I care about. He was my supervising spiritual director when I went through seminary at Houston Graduate School of Theology. And so he and I have worked together in a professor-student capacity. And we also worked together when I was doing my internship at Covenant Church, located in the Museum District, which at that time, that was where he was attending. He's now has lots of other different things that he's doing now. But without further ado, I'd like to invite him to say hello, and then I will ask him some questions, and then we'll get right into it. So Dr. Leudde, if you would just say hello. So
I'm going to say hello and think this is very strange. I do several hours of Zoom and spiritual direction and life coaching every week. And yet the view I have is you all are kind of like a mosaic, and it's wonderful to see you. And all I can say is that we'll get used to this. I'll get used to this, and we're going to be real, try to be relaxed with it. I'm not going to thunder forth for too long. And if my dog, who's lying on the floor here, gets in the way, we'll just live with that. So life happens.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the saying hello. So as I said before, Mike Leudde, or Reverend Dr. Leudde, he's a spiritual director, and he's a whole bunch more. He's a college professor and just a whole bunch of other things, and he can add more to his bio as he pleases. But the reason we brought him on is because I wanted us to first think about what we are actually entering into right now, especially as the cases of coronavirus are increasing in the city of Houston and Harris County, and that can be really scary. And so we're in this lingering pandemic, and none of us know exactly how far this will go or where this will end up. But what I do know, as the interim pastoral care coordinator at Resurrection, is that we need to be able to support each other, particularly at the spiritual level. So there's a book called 4 Levels of Healing, and that book the author of the book is Shakita Gowan, and I am going to put in the chat a link to a PDF of the book so that you can see that. Now, there's no requirement that you have already read the book. We're not really focused specifically on the book. What we're focusing on is the lessons that she lifts up in the book, which basically says that in life, we need to focus primarily on 4 aspects: our spiritual level, our mental levels, our emotional level, as well as our physical level. So tonight we're going to focus on the physical levels, and we're Dr. Leudde to come in and talk to us about how do we find the balance, particularly right now, in connecting with our own essence, which is what I would define as the spiritual element. But just how do we find the right balance with connecting with our essence, and also find meaning and purpose in our lives, particularly right now as we are being faced with a situation that none of us could have ever imagined before. So that's a tough question to begin with, but that's where we'll start. We'll let him take it over from here.
That's all you need for me to tell people then? Is how to find it all. Actually, you're going to hear from me that in some ways, I really view the spiritual as the totality of things. So when I talk about the physical, I talk about the emotional, when I talk about the mental side of things, to me, there isn't any aspect of life that isn't spiritual. That the older I get, the more I'm fascinated by finding the holy in the ordinary, and recognizing that it's ordinary life that really is where we find the divine wanting to love us into a continuing being. So, when we first talked about this, Denise gave me the impression that what we were going to be talking about was how to, since we were coming out of the COVID and we're all kind of getting back on our feet again, how do we find balance as we move into life? And we're quite clear now that that's not what's going on. That what's going on is that we have an onslaught of several pandemics, and they affect us on all levels. Certainly we have the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement that has been a pandemic that forces us to be awakened in new ways to injustice and to systemic racism. We have the January 6th insurrection, which is a pandemic that awakened us to a really dangerous situation and a polarization in our country that I've heard some people, some professors of history, liken to putting us on the edge of a civil conflict. And so that's still going on. It's not resolved. We have all the misinformation campaigns about anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers and people who are science deniers. We have the deniers of science, as we learned today from the new UN report, of climate change. It seems that before COVID decided to come back with the Delta variant and stir things up, that there are so many different rugs being pulled out from under us that it's really hard to find balance. That when things keep shifting all the time, then how do you find your solid place? How do you find your ground? And that's kind of where we'll be looking at. So I want to talk a little more about what the situation is as I see it, and then a couple of different ways different perspectives on how we can deal with it. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and some discussion, because you all look like fascinating people, and I want to know what you think. And I've been well aware that I don't have all the answers. I can just pretend I do. So. As I told a group of pastors I met with today in spiritual direction, theological maturity is coming to the point where you don't know what the heck you believe. So we're getting there. I think the result of all of this turmoil and these emotional, political, psychological, spiritual, and certainly medical pandemics, that we're facing, is that we have a kind of a sense of moral injury. We have a sense of so many different ways that we're feeling assaulted and feeling shocked that there could ever be such a thing going on, that there could ever be a pandemic that was allowed and sometimes maybe even encouraged to get out of control to the extent that tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to in this. that creates a kind of a, I don't know about you, I'm feeling a kind of a, what I would call empathy exhaustion. You know, that when I pull away and go up out into nature or go into meditation, that I find myself feeling like I just can't handle a whole lot more suffering right now. That I want to feel empathetic, and yet I sometimes find myself feeling numb. That it's just, there's just too much that's going on. I think I find myself sometimes thinking, as I think about other people who I think should be thinking more clearly, which of course means thinking as I do. I find myself a little bit like Paul Thorne's line in a song he has, I'm not as nice as Jesus. I don't like half the people I love. You know, I find myself getting easily aggravated and easily irritated. And I find myself grieving that there's so many things that are being lost that I once believed in. There's so many things that are under assault that I think are in great danger. And that grief reminds me that grief is an enfolded reality, that when we grieve one thing, it's like an opening up an accordion fold and other unresolved grief issues come up. And so that grief is part of what we're all struggling with right now. The multiple losses on personal, social, relationship, political, and even worldwide kinds of understandings where we just feel struggling. In fact, we wouldn't be having this meeting if we weren't feeling somewhat helpless, if we weren't feeling a little bit like it's too much. And so I want to compliment Denise for her pastoral sensitivity and saying, we're going to talk about this. We're going to think about it. Let me give you some examples from just the last week of people I've talked with, and I'll be anonymous with this as best I can, the people I've met with in spiritual direction and how they're struggling, because I think those examples hold some weight. I have a good friend who's a business manager. He's got a big firm, and he's trying to figure out how to handle COVID in that firm. And some of his people are unvaccinated, and he's trying to recognize, how do I deal with them? And they've created a mask mandate for the unvaccinated people in this firm. But there's one person, an associate in the firm, who absolutely refuses to wear a mask. And it's breaking this person's heart to recognize that he may have to terminate employment for this person. It's a difficult set of decisions to be made that COVID keeps forcing on us. I have a friend who is a grandfather. He's a progressive liberal guy. Denise said I had left Covenant Baptist. Actually, after January 6th, I realized I needed a community where I could be honest. So I'm back at Covenant. But this guy's a member of Covenant. He's vaccinated, but he's afraid to go out. He's afraid to go out anywhere without his mask, but he's really afraid to go out at all because his grandchildren's daycare has been closed because of a COVID case there. And so he's going to be taking care of his grandchildren during the day. And he wants to make sure that he doesn't unwittingly pick up even a low-grade infection or a symptom-free infection that could contaminate his relationship with his grandchildren. That's a high level of anxiety and fear for him. I saw a man this week who is the pastor of a really large church, probably preaches to a couple of thousand people every Sunday. And he's got a staff member in his church who is anti-vax or anti-max. And he says, I don't understand how it is that people who say they follow Jesus think Jesus said, you have an absolute right to put other people's health at risk. And it's tearing his heart out. He is a very loving pastor. And he doesn't quite know how to handle the obvious division within his congregation. I have a neighbor. She and her wife are a delightful young couple. And one of them is seriously ill with a chronic lung disease. And the other one is a teacher. And she now has to go back and teach in a middle school classroom and wondering how in the world she can do that when the school will not have mask mandates, when when their school district's not willing to do serious contact tracing. And she knows that if she were to catch an asymptomatic infection and bring that home, that her wife would die. And that's the fear she's living with. I talked with a pastor recently who is trying to thread the needle of his anger and rage at his own children because they are refusing to take the safety precautions that need to be taken. And trying to remind himself that their unwillingness to get vaccinated isn't a way of saying to him, we don't care what happens to you. He's trying not to take that personally. These are great struggles that each of us have. And I don't know about you, but I find myself struggling a lot with just anger and rage. And I agree with the New York Times headline. You know, what about rage at the anti-vaxxers or whatever? I'm trying to be understanding and trying to be sympathetic but I'm not doing a very good job of it. I'm angry about unnecessary deaths. I'm angry about people having to feel such fear. I'm really frustrated with Texas politics. And I, if it's troublesome to you that I've given away a political view in this as we were talking, I gotta say, I just can't help it. Our politics are part of our spirituality and reflect it. I'm terribly distressed that the majority of white evangelicals are just out in right field somewhere, and I can't figure out what to do with them. So I also feel that the faith that I profess, that the tradition I come out of, is under assault in the midst of all this craziness that we're going through. So we feel a kind of a shock. We feel a kind of an emotional numbness, a kind of a moral injury, a kind of an empathetic overload. And the question becomes, how in the world could this be happening in an educated scientific society where we ought to all know better? But it is what's happening. And it's a reality we have to deal with. So sometimes we're better at diagnosing the problem, than giving answers. As I spent, nearly 40 years as a psychotherapist, as well as a pastor and spiritual director. And so what you get to do as a therapist is you get to do this. Well, how do you feel about that? And you get to say, well, how are you going to solve that problem? Or, gee, that sounds like a big deal. And so then, you don't ever provide solutions, because for the few times I have provided solutions, I realized people are paying me $100 an hour to not listen to what I have to say, so why provide solutions? At any rate, I'm going to try to provide some answers, some things that work for me that I think working for other people. And the first are some things we can do under our own initiative. And they have to do with interpersonal spiritual healing. Spiritual healing is not just a matter of what happens when I'm alone somewhere on a mountaintop, like the one behind me at Big Bend, but when I'm really feeling a sense of community and contact with other people. And I want to reaffirm, as I said earlier, there is nothing in life that's not spiritual. I love Richard Rohr's new book on the universal Christ, which recognizes that the first incarnation was the Big Bang, that God permeates everything, whatever God is, and I haven't figured out that yet, but that loving depth permeates all that is, and every dimension of life, and all of life is spiritual. And we can get caught up in times like this and lose our perspective on that. So what matters as we pursue spiritual life in our relationships, as we pursue spiritual life in community, is what our intent is. Do we have an intent to be open to the depths of life that are right in front of us all the time? Do we have an intent to be enlightened to be able to receive and to give love. And there's some specific things we can do. The first is to recognize that loving spirit, which is what brings us back to balance, is found in an intimate and vulnerable community. I appreciate Brene Brown's work, particularly in talking about vulnerability and intimacy. You cannot have an intimate community, despite all the highfalutin language church people use. You can't have it if it's not intimate, and you can't be intimate if it's not vulnerable. Community has to be a place where it's safe to recognize that people can wound you and they won't. That it's safe to say, this is who I am, this is where I hurt, this is what my needs are, this is what my deepest hunger is, this is what my deepest fears are. And to recognize that when I share what's deep with me, it's other people are going to resonate with that, because what's most personal is also most universal, and that other people are going to connect, and they're not going to diss me in some way, but they're going to hear and respond. And I think, Denise, what you're trying to do pastorally is create a vulnerable community, because there is no intimacy unless there's vulnerability. And there's a horrible term you hear in church, and I don't know whether you hear it at your church, but it's called Christian fellowship. I don't know what that is, but it usually means people being nice and dishonest with each other. And it's kind of like you go to coffee hour and you have the coffee equivalent of a cocktail party. And so, but it's not intimate, vulnerable community. So the first thing we need to do is be searching for and enabling and helping that kind of community to happen that puts us back in balance. We need to be seeking one-on-one friendships. One thing that's come to me clear in this year and a half or so of COVID is how really important some loving, intimate friendships are. One-on-one context, deep, the value of a deep, trusting, loving friendship. And I just think that's an essential thing for us to stay in balance and survive. And particularly on a spiritual level, where we can share our fears, our doubts, our hunger, our experiences that might be transcendent and wonderful, but where we can really be honest with each other. And those kind of friendships take work, they take searching, they take risk, and all too often we don't have them in our lives, but they are essentials, I think, to keep spiritual balance. I think that all of us, every one of us needs a spiritual director. Every one of us needs somebody who is about one step farther down the path, not a whole lot farther down the path. We don't know, we're all at different places, to the path to wholeness and enlightenment and understanding and self-awareness and spiritual depth. But we need somebody who can be a mentor and a guide, who has a little bit of training and a little bit of experience, where it's a little bit like psychotherapy. I think probably most of us are somewhat familiar with what therapists do, besides sit around and say, "Uh-huh, and how you feeling?" They respond. I'll give you an example of my own life. I saw a therapist when I realized I had been sexually abused, and this was back in the late 90s. Took me 3 months to tell her why I was there, because there was such anxiety for me around that issue at the time. And yet, and I'm kind of Jungian oriented and existential oriented, my therapeutic approach. And she's a cognitive behaviorist. And we couldn't be farther apart and the theory behind which we do therapy. But what I sensed with her was that she really cared about me. And she brought that empathy. She brought that concern. And I think that's what you need to be looking for as you seek out a spiritual director, somebody who can be present with you. I think we all need, frankly, in our toolkit, a therapist and a director and a really, really good friend that you meet with at least once a week for coffee, for lunch, whatever. I think one of the things we really need on a community, on a relationship level, and Denise, you can speak to this later if you want to, all of you could probably. We need meaningful rituals. Because one of the functions of ritual can be empty and can be meaningless. But when it's meaningful and rich, as it can be in our religious services, ritual provides balance. It provides a way to help us reorganize our life. It's a dramatic reenactment of the things that we hold dear, and that the story we share in common. And there'll be parts of those rituals we don't agree with. Some churches have creeds or that sort of thing. You may say, well, I don't agree with those, or I don't believe them anymore. That's okay. These are ways in meaningful ritual, we tell our story and we reenact it, we reaffirm it, and we talk about what we share. And I think we really need that to survive in these kind of times. We need worship that touches our heart and that opens us to our feelings. And that provides meaning. Some people define spirituality as what gives meaning in your life. Ritual needs to be a way that helps reconnect us with that meaning. We need, I think, groups. I don't know what your church has in the way of small group programs, but we need groups of 5, 6, 7, no more than 10 that we meet with on a regular basis, kind of like the old-fashioned prayer groups. But where people can share intimately and vulnerably and safely, where there's not a lot of crosstalk. A good model would be what's involved in a good AA or recovery group. But we need those kind of groups, not just for recovery. We need those kind of groups in the church where people can feel like this is a safe community. You can't have a safe community with 200 people on Sunday morning. You can have a safe community on Tuesday night with 8. And I think we need that. The church I go to has what they call deacons groups. And every deacon in this church is assigned a member of the church that they're responsible for providing pastoral care for. But every deacon in that group also leads a small group that meets with certain guidelines that allow the group to develop over the course of the year they meet together, that kind of safe, supportive spiritual community. These are all things that really help us hold together because we don't just do this alone. The spiritual journey is not something we do by ourselves. It is something we share. It looks like this mosaic of people that I'm looking at on this, where I'm looking at right now. One thing, I should take this off, this background I've got, and you could see what my wife's half of my study looks like. What she would say is her study. So behind me. I love being able to see people's rooms. I love houses. I love, I'm going to miss Zoom when it goes away. It opens up to a type of contact that we don't get sometimes in ordinary social things. So that's one level. It's a communal, relational, spiritual level of spirituality that's terribly important. And then when we often think of providing spiritual balance, we talk about the intrapersonal. If that's the interpersonal, there's the interpersonal. What goes on inside our heads, our hearts, what's happening inside our bodies, where we have to ask ourselves, what are the practices that we have that help us keep spiritual balance? What are the things we do that kind of, and frankly, you could just have all of you share what you're finding is working on a personal level in your practice. And that would be a rich way to spend this evening, but I'm going to keep talking for a minute. So I was reminded by a talk by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen monk, who said, when one Buddhist meets another, the first question is, what is your practice? It's a great question. What practices do you have? I think one of the ultimate levels of spiritual awareness on an interpersonal level, and I'll come back to this, and recognizing balance and healing, is to be aware that each of us is deeply beloved. There is nothing you can do to interfere with that belovedness except to try to talk yourself out of it, but you can't get rid of it. There is an inner core deep within us that we find often in the midst of crisis, that there is an unexplainable, unshakable peace at the very bottom of all the turmoil. That while the storms are raging around us, at the upper levels of our consciousness, somehow there's something foundational that we need to keep doing our spiritual practices in such a way that we keep reconnecting with that foundational reality that is within us. And it goes by lots of names, but there's an inner anchor below our grief and our pain and our fear and our anxiety. Some practices that some of you use, and these are popular, are called apophatic. That means imageless. They have to do with closing your eyes and going into meditative silence. Sometimes listening to music, but imageless, so that you learn in the course of that meditation to let go of the busyness of your mind, what the Zen masters call the monkey mind, the inner chatter, and to recognize that below that chatter, and as you move deeper in through your levels of consciousness, that there is something really positive and peaceful and loving that wants to connect with you, and that you want to connect with. Some practices are what are called cataphatic. They are with images. As a photographer of nature and wildlife, I'm a great believer in what I would call visio divina. That is wholly looking. I do a lot of meditative walking. I find that I'd never go anywhere without a camera, even if it's just my iPhone, because frequently something will yell out at me, take my picture. It might be the deer that live here where I am, or the alligators, or the waterfowl. It might be a flower. It might be a backlit leaf somewhere. But learning to see the divine in the midst of reality is a very important practice for me. I thrive and live on nature and being in contact with nature. Not only going to spectacular places like Balanced Rock behind me at Big Bend, but at going to really ordinary places, the ordinary sacredness of seeing the shell of a cicada on a stucco wall and recognizing the life that gave birth from that shell, and that life and my life share the same life in some way, of having a conversation with a raccoon that's sitting on the wall outside our apartment, that I recognize and is a neighbor. That there's a connectedness, there's a oneness, that spiritual depth that we share with all of reality. And I encourage you to have conversations with armadillos and lizards and deer and alligators and bugs and worms. That's an important part of practice, to recognize that there's a oneness to things that is there when it looks like everything is being torn apart. It's looked that way before in history. Those things happen. It's not the last word. This will pass, and that oneness will continue. And we need things that remind us of that. I think an important thing to do in your own inner spirituality, as James Finley says, is find a teacher, find the practices that teacher recommends, and stick with it. Don't be a cafeteria spirituality person where you go, I'll take a little of this Hinduism, I'll take some of that Buddhism, I like some Native American, I've got a drum, maybe I can beat on that. But go deep within what you're familiar with, because when you go deep, inevitably you will transcend it and find what is universal. So find a spiritual teacher. For me, it's been Thomas Merton, more than anybody else, the Trappist monk and his writings, who has shaped my own spirituality. Physical exercise is an important spiritual practice. I'm a jogger, I'm a biker, cyclist, I'm a walker, I'm in the gym several days a week. I might be listening on AirPods to some spiritual talk. I might be listening to ZZ Top, or Strauss waltzes. But it's all spiritual. What you're doing with your body is a way of praying. Learn that. Learn that. Practice death. This gives you a perspective on all the stuff going on in life. Make friends with death. With the death of your own egocentricity, with the fact that that your life is fragile. As James Finley likes to say, God loves you into being. And if God decided that on the count of 3, he would stop loving you or she would stop loving you, you wouldn't be there. So love is what holds you in being, and love is going to transcend death. So make friends with it. Love is stronger than death. Do some journaling. Pay attention to the movements of your own psyche and your own soul. Pay attention to your dreams. Recognize how the divine is working within your own heart. Journaling is really an important practice. Do creative work. Write poetry, paint, take pictures. Creativity is an important expression of your own spiritual depth. Practice silence. Go out into nature and recognize that there's a silence in nature that doesn't have to do with lack of noise. It has to do with the silence of the presence of a mystery that you can't comprehend. You can go into nature and feel silence like it's a garment on your skin. Practice silence. Listen to music. Do whatever feeds your soul and your heart. Look for the sacred ordinary. I had a friend who was a pastor in Friendswood who said there was somebody in his church who during coffee hour used to walk around and tap people on the shoulder and say, "Are you paying attention?" You know, if you're paying attention, all this stuff is going to happen for you. As the Zen Buddhist says to his disciple, the disciple says, "What is Zen?" The master says, "Did you see the bird?" The disciple says, "Yes." He says, "That is Zen." The spirituality is there everywhere you look. Practice it, learn to see it, learn to perceive it. And be patient. Spiritual growth takes a lifetime. Be patient. Be willing to suffer a bit. We all do that. So that's the second thing. The first thing is our interpersonal. The second is our intrapersonal. And the third thing I'll just touch on briefly, because I told Denise I talked way too long all the time. Be open to mystical surprises. I wrote a book called Sex, Spirit, Selfhood, which I think you should all buy. It's kind of a spiritual autobiography. But the core of that book was a moment of spiritual healing I had that I did not expect. It took 10 years for me to come to terms with, and totally called for a total reorganization of my life. There's a line in the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament that says it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Well, it really is. My life got deconstructed and reconstructed based on a surprise mystical experience that I didn't expect to have happen. Those things happen to us. Research shows that roughly 75% of people have something that out of the blue is a kind of a transforming experience that they didn't expect. They don't share it with people because they think nobody else can understand it. And yet it's a very common thing for people. If it happens, treasure it, find someone you trust, and talk about it. And recognize it could take you, as it took me, 10 years to make any sense out of it. That is another level of things to help keep balance. So Denise said you need a takeaway from all this. So I will tell you, my takeaway would be for this. Recognize among your relationships and in yourself, there is an immutable and indefinable but undeniable presence of the spirit of love that exists at your core, in your heart. And recognize, as Thomas Merton wrote, every day love corners me somewhere and surrounds me with peace without having to look very far and very hard or do anything very special. That's it.
Wow, so many nuggets. I can't even attempt to try to restate all of them, but the one that really stood out of me is to be ready for the mystical surprises and to pay attention to that. Many, many more. So I want to encourage you to put comments that you have in the chat. And I want to thank and George, they're answering some of the questions that you all have asked about some of the small groups that we have at the church. And now, instead of going to the second question, we're ready to sort of take your questions. So if you would just unmute yourself, not everybody at the same time, obviously. And you can also, if you have the feature where you can raise hand, I can attempt to recognize you. But if you have a comment that you want to make or a question before we go into the other prepared questions, I think this is a good time for us to take those now. So if somebody want to unmute themselves, and also be mindful that we are recording this event tonight. Surely there's at least one person who just can't wait to get out there. Go ahead, Virg. Thank you.
Hi. I probably wanted to add to that. I mentioned a couple of online groups or Zoom groups that helped get me through the pandemic, but other things I do. But of course, also the Wednesday night groups here. I feel like I've gotten to know people a lot better. And when I was home, that weekday group was really great. And so just having people, I felt like I still had a sense of community, even though I wasn't out in community. I mean, I went to work every day, but yeah, and that has its own challenges, and kind of how I get through the day some days is that I just sort of meditate. Sometimes I pray, like, God, get me through this day, but a lot of times I'll just take, I'm not good at setting aside, a chunk of time to meditate. Even today, I tried to get to the gym, and then I got to the gym and I realized that I was already going to be late for this. So I didn't have time for the gym. And so, and so we're constantly, I think a lot of us doing that, chasing our tail, and so anyway, so a friend of mine taught me years ago with meditation, don't try to set aside the half hour or even the 10 minutes, because you might never get it, especially if you're going into social work. So you take the 2 minutes when you can get it. So a lot of times I'll meditate for just a few minutes before I go into work. And I've started a habit of just saying, God, let me be a blessing, to somebody. And sometimes my prayer gets answered and sometimes it doesn't, but and so, and I just, when I have a moment, I just kind of take a moment. And that's how I manage to stay relatively sane. But yeah, I'm really jealous that you can go for hikes, like wherever you live, that you can go for hikes. I mean, but
actually,
yeah.
I live in Clear Lake City, across from the Space Center, in an apartment complex that's on the water and next to the nature preserve. And
oh,
so,
that's awesome. Yeah, I take my dog
it's
to
a
the
great
park.
apartment to be in, and I feel very blessed to be here. And you are a blessing. And you bring up some really wonderful observations. We have this idea that we're all going to live like we're monks or in a monastery somewhere, and we're going to have all this time to go deep. And, our lifestyle doesn't always permit it. And we need to practice when we can. And when we don't, we have other practices. And your practice of finding that 2 minutes, a good book on that is Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Miracle of Mindfulness, kind of his classic book. And he talks about mindfulness meditation in terms of if you're stopped at a traffic signal, that's a good time to breathe. And a traffic signal ought to be worth 3 good breaths. You know, if you're in line at the grocery store, be grateful and thankful that you're having to wait in line. And that's a time to breathe and be aware of the people around you. That if you have an Apple Watch that reminds you to breathe, pay attention to it. Each one of those moments of breath, when we take in the spirit, when we take and we breathe out our attention and anxiety, and we recognize that we are connected, they help create a moment of solitude in the heart that we wouldn't have otherwise. So it doesn't have to be, I mean, it's great to have those big times, and it's great to take a few days on a retreat somewhere, but you know, our lifestyle doesn't always permit it. And sometimes, although we also need to look deeply at our lifestyle. You know, how do we give up more control over our time than maybe we should? How are we doing on setting boundaries? You know, those kind of questions. I appreciate what you share because it's relevant to all of us.
Yeah, that's great. There's someone else, we won't have time to get everybody in, but I certainly want to get as many of you as possible. Yes, George.
Yeah, I just wanted, for those of you that don't know, that RMCC offers an opportunity for you to meet with folks for half an hour to 45 minutes, 6 days a week. 6 days a week. That's the noonday devotional from Monday through Friday. And then the brunch buddies on Sunday after church. And then we do have some home groups. We have one group that meets Friday mornings at 9. We have some other home groups. So if you're interested, just put it in the chat and we'll try to get that information to you. But Mike, you alluded to something that makes it safe and something that we've been meeting since March of last year in the noonday and brunch buddies virtual. And we have met every day of those 6 days, and we have become an awesome family. And it's a safe place to be. And we laugh and we cry and we go through each person's journeys. And it's just a wonderful way for us to touch base every day. And you don't got to come every day, you know, but it's there. And then we also have the Wednesday night classes, and we have Tuesday night choirs, if any of you like to sing and want to get involved that way. And we have classes on Thursday. We have other things going on, but I just wanted to make a note that there are 6 days a week that you can connect with other people in a safe place.
That's really wonderful. And it can be, of course, I'm an extreme introvert. So I'm really into Zoom, you know. And Covenant Church has been having a virtual coffee hour after worship on Sundays. And so you get like 50 people on the mosaic on the screen. But then after some time for announcements or what concerns people raise, they divide that into breakup groups with 5 or 6 people in them. And you spend a variety of that coffee time with 5 or 6 people that maybe you wouldn't have contacted otherwise. And there's a lot of us who don't want to go back to doing coffee hour in person, because, you know, you don't have to worry about who am I going to talk to? Do I interrupt their conversation? And will they want to hear what I have to say? And you know, all those crazy questions we ask ourselves, and we got a little social anxiety. Hey man, Zoom just does it for you. Anyway, but I appreciate you sharing what you're doing, because it sounds like you're very mindful about keeping these practices open for people.
Is there
I agree wholeheartedly with Mike and Georgette as someone that attends these functions as often as I possibly can. I was just telling the brunch buddies on Sunday that, to me, since we've come on Zoom, it's far more intimate than it is that if we're sitting at a long table in a restaurant and I can only really talk to the person sitting immediately next to me. If I'm on Zoom, I can engage with the entire group of like 10 people, like Mike said, that comes. And even the Wednesday night classes, when I used to go in person, I struggled to hear because the room is so boomy. And so if someone on the other side of the room was speaking, I couldn't hear what they're saying and I couldn't engage with them But on Zoom, every word is crystal clear. So I'm so grateful. And now I live in Austin. I've moved 2.5 hours away from Houston, and yet I'm still deeply connected with my family in Houston. So that's some of the things that I do to stay sane.
That's good. Christina asked a question about how you find a spiritual director. You can ask Denise how to find one. She might know. You could ask, I'm open to people. You could ask me how to find one. Spiritual Directors International. And I think their website used to be sdiworld.org. I think it's been changed to sdicompanions.org. But Spiritual Directors International has something called the Seek and Find Guide. And every person who's been through a training program in spiritual direction, who's a member of SDI, that wants to be listed in that guide is listed. And they're listed geographically. And they're listed in terms of some notes about what traditions they're out of and that sort of thing. And that would be a place to look. So it is still a developing movement. In the last, it was kind of brought back to earth, back to life in the Christian tradition by Thomas Merton, and then kind of was caught on in the last 30 years, particularly maybe the last 20 internationally. So it's a great movement to be a part of. And in fact, if you're interested, you could even become a member of STI yourself and get their journal, and so it's a good journal. Some other publications they put out. But churches normally take people in their spiritual development to about the first 3 levels. That is to a pretty good conventional level of how to be religious in that tradition. But when you encounter the doubts and the questions, when you encounter the hunger of your heart, you just know there's got to be more. How come they're not feeding me in the church? That's when seeking out a mentor, a spiritual director to lead you farther along that path is very important. Finding people, the real saints that you have there at MCC, who you just sense. You can sense the presence in them in some way. You can sense they're transparent to that love that's at the heart of the universe. And you can maybe feel them out as to whether they're somebody you might want to talk with. So that's some ways to do it. With therapists, it's a little harder to find. Therapists are not always, they don't get enough training in this. And it kind of bothers me, but it's the way it is. They should.
Okay, someone else have a question or a comment? I'm actually curious if some of you can answer the question that Dr. Leudde posed earlier, which is what are some of the things that you're actually doing? And so I know we've had a few people to go to speak. So is there someone else who would like to share, or if you have a question that you would like to ask him while you have access to him? So some of you may be raising your hand on the screen, but if you would just unmute yourself and talk, that would be better.
One of the things that I find, I feel really close to God in nature. And I walk Memorial Park twice a week. And when I do, I'm noticing all these things around me, like I completely feel God's presence there, even in some of the interactions that I have, whether they're verbal or nonverbal with other people. Even the plants and animals, as Reverend Leudde was saying. But one of the things that I do at the end is I walk over, and it's close to the church. There's a little sanctuary there that they have with benches. And I literally go and I touch the leaves of plants, because to me, that's still touching God's life, right? I mean, we don't have access to touching each other right now, but just actually touching the things that have been created by the divine is an absolute way to have a spiritual encounter. And I encourage you to take a moment. If you haven't been to Memorial Park, it's called the Eastern Glades. It's so beautiful and peaceful. It's so different from what they've had in the past. It's an excellent practice that I like to do.
Appreciate you sharing that. And if for some reason, I don't know why touching a leaf triggered this for me, but one thing I didn't say was pursuing intellectual understanding. You know, St. Anselm had a formula, credo ad intelligam. I don't in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. Faith comes to us in non-cognitive ways. In all kinds of, lie on your back and look at a cloud. Be moved deeply by something somebody shares. A moment of somebody you'll never see again on TV that just touches you. But we also need to use our minds, and for me, trying to find a way to think about spirituality that is consistent with a new cosmology, with an emerging understanding of an evolving universe, with quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and you know, the wonders that has revealed to us, and new metaphors, new ways to think about what we call God that are perhaps not ways we've ever come up with before, because nobody was thinking like this before. You know, thinking about creation as the possibility of the collapse of waves of probability within multiple universes. Who knows? I mean, you can have fun with this because nobody really knows. But finding something that is, as you think about this world with the spiritual life, that read things that challenge you intellectually and that make you think in new ways. Judy Canato's got some great books on physics and spirituality. There's a lot of that kind of stuff around. It's good. It's fun. Ilia Delio's books and her work on evolution and cosmology and the incarnation. You learn even more deeply as you touch those leaves, and you realize they're responding to you. That we're all part of this. There is only one reality.
Does anybody else have a comment or a question? And again, rather than raising your hand on Zoom, just go ahead and unmute yourself. You know, one of the things that in the book, the 4 levels of healing, the author talks about this, the idea that in the US, we rarely encourage people to focus on the spiritual side of life, that we're constantly asking people to intellectually engage, or to use the mental side of themselves more, and maybe even the physical side more. And what can happen is that people, you begin to suffer or not be as prepared as you could be for these very crises kinds of modes that we're dealing with. And so what she encourages is to not only focus on those other aspects, but to make sure that you're paying attention to yourself in that regard and spending time with self. And so I'm wondering, Does anybody struggle with the silence or the time that you do have alone? Is that a challenge for people, or is what Dr. Leudde is saying right now, is this something that you find more doable in our society?
You're going to all be silent about silence.
Hi, I'm Laura. Yeah, silence actually is one of the harder things for me to do, is to be in silence, because I spend a fair amount of time wherever I'm at in the house alone, because I can't just get up and do. So just spending time in quiet and not doing anything, that's like almost impossible to do. And I don't know, do y'all have any suggestions of how to help with being comfortable in silence? Because for a long time, silence and being alone, it's very scary for me. And so I'm open to anything that y'all might suggest or have an idea about.
It can be scary. It can be scary. And one of the things silence does is bring out whatever in us we don't want to listen to, and whatever in us we fear. And it can make us recognize our loneliness. And that can be a reason that we leave the TV on, that we want to have music going all the time, that you become Facebook addicted, that there's so many, we are a culture of deeply superficially connected people who are experts at distracting ourselves from ourselves by looking at our screens, by listening to our devices, by listening to TVs and music. Silence can be very difficult, and I appreciate your struggle with it. It doesn't come easy to know that in silence is the still small voice that Elijah encountered when he finally had to face where God really was hiding. If I were to tell you the story of my meditation, if I'm doing 20 minutes, the first 10 are chaos. I mean, just noise. It tends to move from whatever you're thinking about that day to whatever problems you're solving. Then it moves a little farther into maybe some deep insight that you wanted to have, that you just want to stop your prayer at that point and go right down that insight. And then it gets deeper, and then it gets into troubling stuff that bubbles up out of your unconscious, or you can have some magnificent sexual fantasies, or because you're going deeper into the unconscious realities and to yourself. And we want to avoid all that. We don't want to get in there and live with what's in there. And so, and then a miraculous thing kind of begins to happen after about 10 minutes. You kind of notice that the monkeys have kind of quieted down in the trees, and when they do chatter, you're not paying attention to them. So it does take practice, but I also think an important recognition is to ask yourself in your journaling or in your thinking, and then your conversations with friends, what am I afraid of? Is it my loneliness? You heard of that book, Bowling Alone? It was a sociological study done several years ago. In fact, wondering, the image he used for a study was that people used to belong to bowling leagues, and now people bowl alone. What's happened to our sense of community and connection? Do you have, are you dealing with some disabilities that limit your activity? Yeah, and that's especially tough. So the Zoom meetings that Craig mentioned that, happen every day.
Yeah, I just found out about them. I've been to the virtual resurrection services a couple of times, and there was stuff brought up this past Sunday, so I decided to look more in depth at what all was going, and I just saw them, but it was like, okay, what do I do? So this was my first one. I actually registered to and said, okay, let me check it out, because Zoom works better for me. I've also not only disabled, my immune system is low, so I have to be very careful.
Right.
So yeah.
You've had the courage to step out and to reach out. And when you do that, you've heard some things from other people that may be options. It's amazing what's available these days through online connections. I have a good friend who's in addiction recovery, and he has found that actually he can't get to groups, but he's found some Facebook addiction recovery groups that are actually very supportive and helpful for him. And he goes to one of those every day. I've got another person in spiritual direction who's got 20 years of sobriety, and she's got 4 different groups she goes to every week. She's so busy living alone that she probably hasn't time to really think for herself too much. So you're doing something really important. You're reaching out and you're taking a step, and hopefully you'll do that more.
So if I could, I would like to speak to you, Laura, because I, like you, have some disabilities. Hopefully mine are temporary. But when the pandemic first came, if any of you that have known me previously, I am super social, always out doing things, always with lots of people, always planning something, always something going on, always, always, always. And so the pandemic hit, my job sent me home. I wouldn't go meet with my friends because I was afraid for them as well as me. And I had to teach myself to convert from being an extrovert to an introvert. And meditation was not easy, that quiet, alone thing. So what I found helped me to get into a space was to hyper focus on something specific. I might do an online paint course. They had them really cheap for a while there, where I could just focus on this one canvas, and there's not really any interaction needed. It's just I'm focusing on that one thing. I did the same thing with crocheting a blanket. Just hyper focus on that one thing, and then you kind of forget that it's quiet. And that really helped me to learn to get to a space, that hyper focus. And I'm proud to say I'm pretty much an introvert now. I enjoy my time at home. I'm scared they're going to make me come back to work. I don't want to go.
Welcome to the minority. They say 75% of the population is extroverted. Restaurants are even designed to sound noisy when there's only 3 or 4 people in them, because it sounds like people are having fun. I don't get it, but that's one of the, and I really appreciate what you're saying, that your crocheting could become a form of meditation. Remember, what matters in turning these kind of activities, repetitive activities that you're focused in, it makes them prayer or meditation, is the intent. So if you could say, in this, I'm going to go and move into this space and be open to what happens here. That itself is a good practice. And I appreciate your sharing. My wife's a knitter. She doesn't meditate. But she's lost.
I've tried knitting. I can't get that.
She gets into the flow when she knits, and so that's another way to do it. One of the things that I should have mentioned this. People who are wanting to practice some form of meditation and it just seems foreign, is there's a wonderful app. There's actually 2. There's one by Andy put a combo called Headspace. And both of these I'm going to mention. To use them for very long, you got to buy into them, but they're worth it. And Headspace is a good one. The one I tell people to start with is called Calm. And Calm has everything from the daily Calm, which is just a 10-minute guided meditation, to 20 minutes of silence that you can have maybe a meditative gong or bell rung every 5 minutes to kind of call you back into what you're doing, and that's it. You can, Calm has music, different kinds of music available. And if you're having trouble sleeping, it even has stories guaranteed to put you to sleep. So, but Calm is worth exploring and getting to know, and it's a good way to get an entry into this meditation stuff if it seems foreign to you. It's a good app.
Okay, we'll take one more comment if there is one, or one more question if there is one. And then I'll move on to my last question. Again, I encourage you to just unmute yourself if you have something you would like to add. Yes, Terry.
I'm enjoying this topic because I used to be that I could never sit in silence. Not only did I have to do one thing, have something going all the time, I'd be having to do two things or so at one time, like watching TV and putting together a puzzle, or you know, just doing two things at the same time. After I was associated with a person who talked to me about mindfulness, because I was talking about I couldn't rest at night. I would stay up till late at night. It was like I feared the night or something, I don't know. And it was hard at first to practice mindfulness, because like you said, your mind just wanders, wanders, and wanders. But there are some great YouTubes also that you don't pay for them. You just go to YouTube and put in mindfulness meditations. And some of them are just give you a light sound, and some of them are guided. Someone talks to you with this really soft voice. And when I first tried doing it, I thought, I can't do this. I can't stop thinking about everything else. You know, I'm thinking about paying the bills, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, and, you know, making my grocery list. And you really have to practice. And what helped me is I was told, just think about what it feels like to breathe. Yeah. Your own breath, feeling your chest move in and out, feeling the air move in and out. And I said, this will never work for me. It finally did when I opened myself up to it. I no longer have to have the TV on if I'm alone, or, you know, be doing two things at one time. I tend to like it quieter now than I did used to, because I was just burning the candle at both ends, running here, there, everywhere, and overextending myself. And oh man, that's no way to live. But mindfulness, and just go to YouTube and put in mindfulness videos, mindfulness, and it'll bring up a ton of them too. Thank you.
I appreciate you sharing that. And, you know, the reason we call these practices is you have to practice them. And the, you know, and that's particularly true with all our distractions. You know, the saying about in the Zen world is, don't try to think, but don't try not to think. You cannot not think. You know, if the mind thinks it is the whole personality, it's the whole psyche. The mind thinks it's your soul and your heart, and it wants to constantly be on center stage. And so a lot of this is just, you know, as in crocheting, learning to just Remind the mind, it's a good tool. You're glad to have it. It's useful, but you're going to ignore it. You are not your mind. It's funny we call this mindfulness practice because a lot of what we're doing in mindfulness practice is learning not to pay attention to our mind anymore. They used to say in California in the 60s, lose your mind and come to your senses. And, it tells you how old I am.
Thank you for that. So as it's about 7:20, we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I'm wondering if anyone is thinking about the fact that, you know, we're on code red again. And if you're having a sense of a challenge with how, if we get to the point to where we have to spend less time with other people out in public again, which, you know, many people are encouraging that already, along with wearing masks. But you may be wondering, how will you go back to being isolated again, or not having as much engagement as we've had in the past. And I am so grateful that we got a chance to get out a little while. It was so needed. I really, really appreciate that. But I'm also feeling this sense of, for me personally, if I had to go back, I'm more ready today because, you know, for one, the fact that I'm vaccinated, so I don't have the worry of how will we survive this pandemic. But I'm wondering if Mike, if you could offer some kind of suggestions or recommendations for how people prepare themselves in the unfortunate event that we, you know, do have to go back to not having school and doing everything virtual again. Is there anything that we can offer?
I want to say that, but I have to recognize that my consultant down here, the furry one, needs to go into the next room. So let me move her and then we'll think about that.
Okay. While he's doing that, are there any comments about what I just stated or asked? Does anybody have any specific curiosities about that?
I don't specifically have curiosities. It just really makes me angry that we, you know, it may be that we've made some progress and that we may be at the point of having to go back to quarantining and limiting movement about, when we, like you said, we have an answer to this. It's called vaccination. And so it just makes me really angry to have to revert back to where we were when there is a potential, a solution to keep us from having to do that, recognizing the impact that it has had emotionally and socially for so many people to have to go back to that state. So I'm so angry right now, I'm close to tears. So I just wanted to share that.
Well,
I'm right there
that.
with you. And then there's an additional anger that people that I love and care about refuse to do it. They, you know, no amount of discussion with them. It's like, well, it's my right to not do it. And I want to respect their right to not do it, but I am scared for them and I don't want to be around them. I'm vaccinated, but it's not 100%. And I don't want to get something that I might give to somebody else. You know, I live in a community that is 95% vaccinated. Those that aren't have immune system issues and cannot get it, or they would have it. But, you know, that's my fear. You know, and my anger, because I feel like I'm still having to protect the person who refuses. You know, why am I still protecting you? Why shouldn't I just let you go on and kill yourself? But I can't. There's that, it's a fight in my head. It's a fight.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. So Dr. Leudde, if you could just as we sort of begin to start wrapping up this conversation, I think it's important that we acknowledge that the anger is there. We acknowledge that the fear is there. And at the same time, we also need to prepare ourselves for how we will be able to breathe through this sort of transition and hope that we don't have to go back to the way it was, but what should we be doing now to just sort of get our minds ready to do this in a way that's spiritually healthy?
You know, I'm reminded of a plaque I used to have on my sailboat when I first started racing and didn't know anything about sailing and about racing. It said, and this was my answer, we might fit in this category: if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS. I don't know the answer. There's a part of me that wants us to go back to shutting down, because I want this settled. And I want legal mask mandates. I want people who won't get vaccinated not to be allowed to go into public venues, not to be able to travel. There's a part of me that's just furious at our wishy-washiness about this, and that it doesn't have to be this way, and we know it doesn't have to be this way. And so, and then I want to be a loving person. I want to be as transparent to Christ as I can. But I recognize he got pissed off at the Pharisees. So I don't know. I don't know how to settle this anger within myself. But I have trouble respecting people. Was it Daniel Moynihan who said you have a right to your own opinion, but you don't have a right to your own facts? I do not respect people's right to their own set of facts. And you know, things are right and wrong, things are moral and not moral in this situation. I can do my best. I'm not a confrontational guy, and I try to be loving and gentle, but I got to do my best to try to listen where people are, bring them along. I got a son who's a QAnon conspiracy guy. We don't talk about that. I just love him. So I try to love the people I can, but I don't have the answer. I think we need to get tougher as a culture. And that might involve, I don't know how that's going to happen in Texas, but in the meantime, so we're balancing. There's no, you use the word balance in the beginning in raising these questions about these 4 areas of healing. That balance act is not going to go away. And I'm thinking of a pastor I met with today who says, on the one hand, I'm feeling great contentment. I'm feeling closer to peace within myself than I felt for a long time. On the other hand, I'm really angry with some of these people. And if we're forced to go back into shutdown, I think we have to learn to live in a non-dual way that makes room for both sides, our anger and our love, and carry them both, because that's where we are. I don't know a better answer than that.
I think that's a beautiful answer, and it definitely challenges us to live in the midst of where we are and the reality of where we are, and that there are people who we love dearly who have their own struggles, and so it definitely challenges us to be loving and to be angry. And so I want to thank you all for participating tonight. I hope this has been helpful to you in some way. And so if you could just put in the chat or at least one word that you're walking away with, we could capture those. So just type for us just one word that you're walking away with. And while those of you who are placing your one word in the chat that you're walking away with, I'll take a few of you if you want to share with our speaker what this time has meant to you, for him, if you just want to thank him. So we can, so I'll take a couple of people who may just want to share with him what this tonight has meant to you. And we have about 1 minute before we close.
Well, actually, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your questions and your comments and the way you shared and your openness, and particularly Laura and Dawn and others of you that you have. We're flying blind here. I had no idea what kind of group this was going to be, but this is a cool group.
Yeah.
Y'all got each other. Hang on.
Yeah. George, I hope you've taken a group photo for us. Yeah. Yeah. This has really been great. And Dr. Leudde, we really appreciate your openness, your willingness
Everybody
to
smile.
share your openness, you're willing to share your what you've learned over these years. This has been really, really good and very, very helpful to people, even if they don't have the words to express it. I know that I'm looking at the faces. And I also want to invite you all to come back next Monday at 6 o'clock, where we will have Dr. Darryl Shorter, who is a psychiatrist, and he will share with us what he is seeing in his work in the community, and some of the things that people are coming in to get help for as it relates to psychiatry and the mental aspect of our healing. So with that, I want to say good night. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing every one of you again next week. Same time, same link.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.